First tip is get prepared so you know what you're doing on the video. Hi folks, bit of a TRC top tips video today. I'm going to be doing some plasterboarding because that's what I've been doing all week, but there's a few basics that I thought would be good to share, and there'll also be a few things in here that even the seasoned DIYers might not have come across. And likewise, if you've got any tips, then make sure you leave them in the comments. First up, one of my top tips is make sure that if you're going to be lying the boards down, that you have no little bits of anything on the floor, because it only takes, especially with 9.5mm plasterboard, it only takes one little nugget of wood on the floor and you'll crush and dent your boards. If at all possible, get a big stack of boards lying on the floor. I always find it far easier to cut them when they're lying flat. It's a bit of a pain if you've got a dog running around because you end up with paw prints up your ceiling, but we're going to work on one at a time. But if at all possible, like yesterday we had a stack of like 10 down here, it means you can work on it flat, and also your scoring and snapping can be a bit easier. Right, first up we're going to measure our board. We're going to be hanging this board horizontally. We're going to be working up to the center of this noggin here. So these blocks, noggins, what do you call it in Scotland? Dangs? Dangs, I think. Anyway, we're going to be working up to here. Now the first thing I've done is I put an offcut of plasterboard. Basically we want to keep the plasterboard up off the floor. Means you're not kind of trapping it between the floor and the ceiling or anything like that, so it's a little bit more forgiving. If there's any movement or even just a little bit of water on the floor, it's not going to start wicking up and ruining your plasterboard. So we're going to measure from there up to the center of our timber here. So you can see this wall here is like a peninsula. It comes out and it just stops. Rather than measuring out to the end of here and cutting it on the floor, it's easier and more efficient, I find, to just run it long. So we know that this is under a full length, so our board will actually come out to here. We'll put our fixings down on that last stud, and then we can score and snap it afterwards. Just so it shows up a little bit easier on the camera, I'll use a pencil just to mark up, but usually I just put a little nick with the knife. So we're coming up 940, preaching to the choir for a lot of you, but straight edge of some sort, something a little bit thinner than this can be quite handy, but spirit level is fine, and of course, the longer the better. And then all we're doing is just running the knife through just to score, and I'm probably cutting about a third of the way through, maybe a little bit more. A little bit on knives, basically the sharper the blade, the easier and the neater the job's going to be. They do get blunt pretty quick when you're working with plasterboard, and that's just the nature of the beast. However, the knife is only ever as good as the blade, so just keep on top of it, make sure you're flipping it round. And also you'll find it kind of gums up a little bit sometimes with the plaster. Just keep scraping it off onto a block of wood or something. So we've now scored all the way along there. Let me show you what we do next. So we're going to carefully lift up the board. And you might not be able to make it out, but there's our score line. Even pressure all the way along, we can just snap that. Now at this point, you've got two options. One is cut it from the underside, which is far easier on smaller sheets and it gives a nicer finish. But in this case, when it's standing up, as long as you've got a sharp knife, just going to cut from above. So I cut from one side in about a third, and the same on the other side. And then that just means it's not going to suddenly rip and tear, because you don't want the paper to tear off. So now I've got the whole board supported, just do the last sort of section there, and that's our piece off. Now, of course, you want to try and use up as many bits as you can. So we'll lie that down and we'll start the next wall with that in a corner. Most of the boards in this room we're running vertically. It's a bit of a one-off on this wall that we're doing today. You'll find sometimes that when you've got a stack of boards leaning against the wall like I've got over there, you might need to cut vertically. And that's fine, you can do that, but what you need to do is make sure that the board is fully supported. So ideally, keep a bunch of them grouped together. What happens if you don't do that is when you lie the spirit level on and you push against the board to cut it, the board can dip away a little bit from your straight edge and the line is never quite straight. So ideally lie them flat, I find. All right, first up, a couple of things. Obviously it's the wrong way around. It's also upside down. We're using tapered edge plasterboard here. Let me give you a quick lowdown on what that is. The go-to option really is normally 12.5mm plasterboard, and it's square edge, which means it's just even thickness all the way across the board, and then we apply a full skim coat over the whole wall and ceiling. That's a great finish. And if this was a house or a normal building, I would definitely be going that route. We're trying to keep the weight down because this is a cabin and we're on a chassis. However, we've gone with dry lining for that reason. So instead of a square edge board, you can see here, it just starts to thin and it's probably about 2/3 of the thickness on the edge. What that means is we only have to put a tape and joint that section. We don't have to skim over the whole board. For that reason, we want to make sure on our wall here, where we're using it horizontally, that our tapered edge is going to be where the next board starts. So we're going to be using our square cut at the bottom. Just chuck those in there for now. Okay, next bit of kind of belts and braces. This is more to do with the fact that this is a moving building. It's on a chassis, whereas you might not need to do this in a house, but I can't see a negative to it. So it's just an extra way of securing your boards. Going to run a bead down each stud. You could probably dampen the studs. PU glue tends to work well when on damp surfaces. I haven't been doing the bottom just because if I need to get my fingers under there to lift it slightly, it makes a right mess on your fingers. I'm going to butt it up against that far end wall so it's nice and square, and we're good to go. A few people thought it was witchcraft in the last video, but this is a drywall bit for a drill, and it's a really handy bit of kit. I'll put one in just so I don't have to hold it, then I'll show you what it does. You can see on the end of the bit here, there's like a steel cup around it. And what that does is it makes sure that the screw can only go in a certain distance. The problem with a plasterboard or drywall screw is you don't want it to puncture through the paper. So the head of it needs to kind of hold the paper down tight, and you don't want to pierce it, otherwise it doesn't do anything. So you could tighten and tighten and tighten, but it won't go in any further than you need to. This collar around it stops that from happening. A box of 10 of these is pretty inexpensive and a really, really good way to go. So I'm putting the majority of our fixings on our tapered section. That means that we know all of those get covered with our jointing compound, and the rest of the wall, I'll probably just put 3. So the bottom one will be underneath skirting anyway. We'll just have 2 in the centre. Right, next bit of witchcraft. A laser level is a really good way to go for doing stud work. You don't have to start putting spirit levels on here, putting pencil marks all over your wall. You can simply turn it on. I'm going to sit it just down on the floor here. And you can see I've got, you probably can't see to be honest, I've got the laser just sat on the centre of this stud. So I know that all the way down there I can put a fixing and I know it's going to hit one of my timbers. And that's that run done. Now, I would usually, especially if I was doing a full skim, probably put into quarters, but I'm just trying to reduce the number of screws, again, because there's less chance of screws popping. And we've got that glue all the way down there as well, so these are just holding it in tight. The glue will go set, and then we're pretty belts and braces. And I will link to one below, which I was testing out a couple of weeks ago, 20, £30, and it will self-level horizontal, vertical lines, anywhere you want it. And unless you're going to be working outside or across really large distances, that would be perfectly adequate. Ah, I just made candy floss out of my glue. Another little tip is don't run all your screws along the bottom until you've removed your blocks. It only takes, 3, 4 screws to hold a sheet into place temporarily. Then you can remove these blocks. Otherwise what happens is they get pinched in and then you can't pull them out, and you end up pulling a bit of the paper out and it can really make a mess of it down the bottom. So now we're completely floating off the floor. That's a consistent 9-10mm gap all the way under. We can now screw all these in. As far as fixings go, drywall screws are probably the most inexpensive hardware you'll ever have to buy. The head on them is a Phillips, not a posi. So if you think you can just pick up your normal screwdriver bit, which you got with your box of wood screws, it won't fit in these properly. And what will happen is it will spin and it will just slip inside the head. So make sure it's a Phillips 2, or sometimes it's PH2 written on the bit. Of course, if you buy a drywall bit with that collar on, it will always be suited for this type of screw. These are called a bugle head screw. You can see there they've just got a kind of a slightly convex cone shape there, and that just holds into this paper surface and clamps it in. A conventional wood screw doesn't work in the same way. So bugle head screw, they use a Phillips bit. And one other thing that you can do is if you are using one of these bits on a drill, I use a drill rather than an impact driver, but if you're using the drill in a corner, you sometimes just can't get in straight and they're protruding. Because we're wanting to skim over the top of these and just fill those holes, we've got a nice dip from that bit. But if you can't do it in the corner, it looks a bit overkill, but I've got this long Phillips bit here. This is actually out of an automatic drywall gun that I've got, but that will get into the corners. So if you can't quite get the angle, or if some of your screws are protruding, it does make sense to go over the wall afterwards. You can run a spatula or a trowel over there. And if you can hear metal and you know it's catching, that's not going to fill properly. So you can just go over afterwards and just tweak all those to make sure everything is sitting in nicely. Right, welcome to the dark side of the wall and the messy side. So I'm now going to score and snap this off. I've put plenty of fixings in there so we know it's nice and secure onto that stud. And I can now just run my knife using this as my guide all the way down. And the super satisfying snap. And in this case, I can cut from the back or the front of the board, which gives me a much better finish on the paper. And that's it. We've now got a really nice flush cut all the way down on the end there. We can choose to put our board on here and some corner beads or whatever route we're going. We might actually be putting the feature timber over the end here just to make a bit of a post. If you were using plasterboard onto old studwork, which is not necessarily plumb, again, it makes sense to run it long and cut it, and that way you're basically scribing to it automatically. Other handy pointers to mention, on all the bedrooms we actually used a shorter screw. They were only 25mm deep, which was fine, and there's actually less risk of hitting any utilities in the wall. We've got 35mm, I think these are, 32, 35mm screws. Now you can buy these collated on strips, and we've got a bunch of them over on the table. We've actually got an attachment which we bought, which we've managed to kind of rig onto a drill, and that will use the collated ones. But actually, by the time you've got a decent bit on here that's magnetic, and you've got, you know, a dozen screws in your hand, by the time you screwed one in, you can reload and you get into a bit of a rhythm. It doesn't take that much time at all. But if you were doing huge expanse, it might be worth hiring or buying a collated screwdriver, especially if you're working overhead and you want a one-hand application. That's where I found it was really helpful. Now, while we're talking about ceilings, my number one tip when you're plasterboarding a house is hire a plasterboard lift. Hire it, buy it, borrow it, do whatever you need to do to make sure you've got a plasterboard lift for doing your ceilings. It is unsafe, not fun, the grounds for numerous arguments when you're trying to use two-step ladders, husband and wife, you know, two mates, whatever it is, trying to get plasterboard up above your head, hold it in place. It's not a fun experience. For the sake of hiring one out, or ask if, for instance, our last house, we always had the plasterer had one and he wasn't using it day in, day out, so we were able to just borrow it from him on the weekend. We'd use it. You can get whole ceiling up easily in an evening using a plasterboard lift. One person application. A couple of other cutting tips. Make sure you've got a dog on hand, especially a fluffy one that can really like pick up the dust and help you clean up afterwards. Come on. When you're cutting, if you're just doing small cuts, another option, rather than measuring out all the time, this is definitely going to be really helpful, thank you, is you can just use your tape measure, and if you're just doing a rip along this, I've got a bit of scrap here, you can run your finger along the plasterboard. If I want a 250mm strip along here, and I can hold the end of my tape measure and the knife blade between my thumb and forefinger, or at least that's how I do it, using that as a guide, really. And then I've got a relatively straight snap. If I was going to be skimming the whole wall, that is a perfectly acceptable tolerance, and that would be perfectly accurate enough. If you're trying to get things really neat because you want to do real minimal amounts of joins and fills and making sure things are snug, then you just use the tape measure. Obviously try and minimize your wastage, but if there are boards left, just score them, snap them, fold them, and make sure you recycle this stuff, because it can all be recycled for good use as well. A lot of plasterboard gets turned into, is it calcium carbonate? And it can be used as a soil improver. And we actually have to do that next year on the farm here. So we're going to be using basically recycled ground plasterboard to add more calcium into our soils, which would change the soil structure and all sorts of other things. So, however, gypsum in general can be used for all sorts of things once it's been recycled. So do make sure you recycle the stuff. So a bit of a top tip summary then. I would say if you can, buy or hire or borrow yourself a laser level, even if it's at the stud wall stage as well. If you're trying to get your studs laid up, you're going to use it at that point. You're going to use it for screwing up plasterboard. You're going to use it for tiling or whatever it might be. Very handy bit of kit. And I will leave a link to both this one, which is the Bosch one, which is really cool. I will also leave the budget one in the description as well. As for the bits, you can't go wrong. A pack of 10 of them, they come in a little tic-tac box and they last a good amount of time. Pack of 10 will easily see you through a whole renovation. The combi drill is going to be just fine for the job. I don't like using the impact driver for it, and I don't think these bits would stand up to it too long either. Whereas in a normal drill on a slowish speed, that's all you need. You can obviously, like I said earlier, get the collated ones, and that's a good option, but don't feel like you need one. Knife, in reality, any Stanley knife is going to do just fine. Just make sure you've got a pack of blades and you can swap them out more than you think. You know, if you're going to be doing it all day, you're going to be getting through a few blades. When you get that sort of white plaster sticking to there, it just blunts the whole thing and just gums it up. So just get something else, scrape it on it, and it will last a little bit longer. In reality, plasterboarding, drywalling, it's a relatively easy DIY task that you can pick up yourself. You can get it done. Of course, the skimming afterwards takes a little bit more technique, and I've done several videos in the past on that. But in reality, if you're going to be getting a plasterer anyway, they can make up for a little bit of the tolerances that you might have had along the way. Well, there we go. Hopefully there are a few takeaways in that for you. I will also leave it to you guys to share all your tips and techniques. Leave them down in the comments. People can benefit from it that way. And hopefully that gives you some of the confidence and just a little bit of know-how to get started on your own project. I'm going to get on with this. We've got another video coming out shortly, which is going to be about insulating the bedroom walls. But, you know, it's more of the same. Hopefully you're going to enjoy following this cabin build process all the way through. We've got a bit more cladding to do on the inside. We've obviously got all the outside cladding to do. There's also some feature walls that we're going to be doing in the bedrooms and the end of this living room. So we're not quite sure what we're doing there yet, but it won't be plasterboard. So there'll be a right mix of things going on in here to make a real feature of the space. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give us a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any DIY action. But I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching. Remember, if you can, do it yourself, and we'll see you next time.